Picture this. During a scouting mission, your spaceship is crash landed on an unknown world. You see other ships crashing in the distance. You realize you must be the first to leave the planet to relay the information. Your crew moves around an alien world, collecting resources from the environment, or sneaking aboard enemy ships and stealing them from your opponents. But your opponents are actively trying to stop you. The race to repair is made more difficult by the need to protect your resources. While out collecting uranium, someone has sabotaged the engine. With no chances of winning, turrets are built in a last-ditch effort to blow them out of the sky. Hi, my name is Leif Petersson. What you have just heard is the story of my board game, which I made called Shipwrecked. This is what it looks like today, after many hours of research, testing, and iterating my designs. But it didn't always look this way. Over the next 360 slides, I'll be talking about how this game has developed from the original version built in grade 6 for a design project. In this presentation, we'll be going over the design cycle, all of investigating, planning, creating, and then finally evaluating to turn it from this original prototype to this final project. While this old one was cool, it was also built in a week with most of the work crammed in on the weekend. Because of this extreme time crunch, I did not have time to do a lot of the stuff that I wanted to do, like making it a 4-player game. And because of the lack of testing, the gameplay was terrible. I thought it would be interesting to come back after a few years and revamp the same idea. Overall, the two versions of the game are actually pretty similar, just having a few upgrades and fine-tuned features to make the gameplay more enjoyable. Before I get into how I made the game, I'm first going to explain how it is played. The game starts by everyone crash landing on the planet by flipping their ship onto the map like a coin. This ship is basically a home base where you collect resources and build upgrades. The main gameplay loop is to move around the board, collecting resources in the speeder, which you can see there. And then these resources you will take back to the ship when it is full, and you can be used to make these upgrades for your ship, so you can be the first to take off, which is the goal of the game. These resources, though, are not safe on your ship. They can be stolen by your opponents. While a few of these parts are mandatory, like navigation and medbay, some of the other ones are not, like the hull upgrades, which are just to make it easier to get through the atmosphere. Something to take into consideration is the more things you add to your ship, the more rockets you're going to need to get off the planet with the extra weight. Now let's talk about some elements. Replayability is very important to games. You don't want every game to feel the same because that's really boring. This is usually done by adding elements of luck through the board layout, cards, or even dice. This randomization can force players to change strategies, making a second game a lot more interesting. This luck can be a very tricky thing to balance, though, because too much can get rather annoying when someone wins without skill. And then on the other side of the balance, you have a better player that always wins, which is also not very fun. In a perfect balance, you're going to have a better player winning most of the time, but then a weaker player will still have a chance of winning with a little bit of luck. Being social makes people happy, so forcing players to interact is a great way to make a game more enjoyable naturally by making them have fun with friends. Without this interaction, it makes players feel like they're playing their own separate game instead of being social. Now I'm going to talk about how other games use these elements. While we now know some things that make a game better, how can these elements be used to make fun and engaging gameplay? Settlers of Catan is a good example of replayability. They used a randomized board with randomized resources to make most games feel different from one another, making you use different strategies to get around its randomness. But this replayability also has the downside of making it a bit too luck-based, in my opinion. Something that annoys me every time I play is I'll get my perfect setup, having me getting resources on 5s, 6s, 8s, and 9s to have the most resources according to the probability, and then I will get rather unlucky. Some random roll like 11, get rolled basically every other roll, giving someone else a lot of resources, even with their worst setup. Another thing this game does well is it has a very good sense of progression. At the start, everything is really expensive, but as the game continues, it gets easier and easier to collect resources, making the ending very satisfying. While most of the games I played were good, this game here, The Crew Mission Deep Sea, is not one of them. This game had a big issue with its story. It didn't really have anything to do with the game, making it feel like a waste of time to read it, because it just had nothing to do with the game. Like, why would you read it on the side? This story was not the only thing wrong with it. The gameplay also felt like it would get old really, really fast, because to add replayability, they added cards that had rules on them, so they would create different situations depending on which cards were drawn. But after an hour of play, we were already seeing very similar situations due to the lack of types of cards. Another issue I found is that it's a cooperative game, then it limited our ability to talk, which is just a limiting of social interaction, making the game just less fun. Also didn't seem to be a ton of point to this, just to make the game harder. The last issue I had was that there was a 16-page rule book for a simple card game. Like, that's completely unnecessary. Super frustrating to start playing. Now let's talk about developing and testing ideas. Now that I've done my research, I can start the iteration cycle. The iteration cycle is a repeating process where an idea is developed, tested, and then finally changed according to the feedback received. This is very important to games because it's very, very hard to find a lot of issues without testing. Like, you don't know how long the game will play until you test. The idea is to go through each iteration pretty quickly and cheaply just to test the features. The original iteration of the game, which I made in grade 6, had these big cardboard painted ships. They were really cool, but there's only 2 of them. And I wanted this to be a 4-player game. And I wanted to test more features, like having 5 parts to fix instead of 3. So I made a new ship. And this ship doesn't look as cool, but it is a lot cheaper to build, being just made out of paper and Sharpie. I even managed to get rid of the need to make these big parts by just having little marker pieces instead. While these ships may look like a slight downgrade, these next ones are even worse. These ships, while they were sketched up in about 20 minutes, have many new features, like upgraded versions of every part, and separate inventories for all the crewmates. The problem with this is, for the first time in the game's history, it was way too complicated. No one was understanding how to play. So I made a few more iterations of this iteration, being this one here with more upgrades and adjusted resources. Neither of these fixed the issue, it just made it way more complex. So I once again made a new ship. This one here, I made with the idea of making it a lot more simple. So I got rid of a lot of those weird upgrades and stuff. I also tried to bring back the actual physical parts because I thought those were really satisfying on the original. This version of the ship, it is the same as the final layout. It's the same as the final version, just a slightly different layout due to texturing. board design. Something I really wanted my game to have was a randomized board DAD replayability. Unfortunately, this version did not have this in mind whatsoever, with having all those resources glued to the map. The next design of the board, I used a base of triangles to get the main shape, and then I covered it in these little resources which the players could pick up. The issue with this is that players would quickly run out of resources, so you'd get less and less as the game progressed, which kind of goes against a sense of progression where you're getting more stuff. I fixed this by having everything printed to the map, which also cut down on how much time it took to set up. The issue with this is the 4 hexagons I had in there, which made big areas without resources, and then all the resources would be in the corner to fill in the space. I fixed this easily by just cutting up the hexagons. The last change I made was I changed the shape of the spaces to make it easier for the pieces to go on, because the thinner ones were a bit tricky, being really thin. Resources. In the first version of the game, I had these resource cards. They're pretty cool, but I decided to change them to these really small triangles. These were pretty good. They were a lot better because they were a lot smaller, and they're a really good placeholder until I figured out what I wanted to do. So what I ended up doing in the end is I used these cubes and metal bars. I got this idea from Terraforming Mars, where they had cubes as resource counters. And I decided to use them because I thought it'd be cool to make your inventory space on your ships and speeders a thing that physically gets filled up, and not just having an arbitrary number as the limit. Now we're going to get on to how I built this final prototype. Artwork. The artwork here was made over the course of a few days by placing textures onto the ship in Illustrator. Many small changes were made from the last iteration, like making the layout slightly different, because it looked a lot better when the hull upgrades were thicker instead of really thin. It was a lot easier to texture. Another thing I changed is Medbay used to be called Life Sport. That name was too long, so I had to change that. You may be wondering where I got these textures. The answer is AI. Most of these were just AI generated, with a few of them just being taken off the internet, with like the background and the little rockets at the end. Once I made the first version of the ship, I made it in 4 colors for the different players. And then I also made speeders, which were made in a similar way, except I based them off of the shape of a patrol boat because I thought it looked cool. The main materials I used for building was cardstock, which everything was printed onto. And then I also had a lot of poster board too to reinforce the cardstock. At first, to connect the two, I used Mod Podge because it was a kind of nice glue that would seal the two and give it a nice finish at the same time. In practice though, when I used it on the triangles, it ended up just bending the entire board. So I decided not to use this going forward. What I decided to use instead is this strong adhesive double-sided tape. The struggle with this was to line it up perfectly because it was so sticky that if it even touched slightly, they would never be coming apart. After connecting these pieces, I also added Mod Podge as a finish on top of them, so they would stick to each other less and get the nice finish. Once printed and connected to the poster board, required a lot of cutting. For the ships and speeders, they had multiple layers, so I had to put those two together using more of this double-sided tape. Also, The ships had an extra special step where I needed to make them fold because they're so big. So what I did is I put some fabric on the back and glued that on because it would bend nicely. In the end, the main thing that happened while making this final prototype was just a lot of cutting because the poster board was really, really thick. So it'd take about 4+ cuts per line, which multiplied by the amount of sides of every piece is a lot. Speaking of sides, let's get into how many pieces there are in total. This copy of the board game required quite a few to function, and this is just ones that I cut out. Each ship required 14 pieces to be cut out for all of the parts to be repaired. The speeders and ships also required another 2 because they had a couple layers. The speeders had 2 of their own upgrades, so I adding another 2 to that. And I had another I had a bunch of little inventory blockers, 8 of them to be exact, adding another large amount. And then of course the ships had to fold too, adding another 2 pieces. Overall, each player required 30 pieces to be cut, making it 120 parts for everyone. But this total does not include the 40 triangles for the board, bringing the total to 160 parts cut. Ordering parts. Well, most of the complicated pieces I built at home, like the ships. There are a few things that would just be tedious or impossible to make, so I ordered online. For example, I am not forging these metal dice, and I am not cutting the rock for those resources. Everything else that I ordered was the other types of resources. Some astronaut meeples, which I had to paint because they didn't come in the right colors, and some containers to make everything fit nicely in the box. To conclude, the ships turned out very well in my opinion. Using Adobe Illustrator to create the ship artwork was a great idea because it made the final product look a lot more complete and professional. I also really like how the ships have layered pieces, so you're not just placing the parts on top of it and you're actually placing it in, so it looks more full and like flat when it's done. I really like the speeders, actually almost more than the ships. What I really like about them is how compact they are, and I really like how the slots accurately depict how much room you have in them. I think it is really cool how the ship tokens are placed on the board by tossing them in the air and letting them crash on the surface of the board. This is rather consistent to the storyline because you have some say on the general area of where you want to go, but you don't have full control. What could be better? There's a lot of things here. While this prototype is good, it has many small issues to take into consideration. One of these small issues is there's nowhere on the board that says what the cubes are, like what kind of resource they are. That's just one of the many small issues that could be fixed. The actual big issue that I have with this design is that all the parts fit very snug in the ship and can't actually fit. This could be done by just trimming all the edges. It just would have been better to do earlier, so then I wouldn't have to trim off the artwork. Another issue is how large the game is. To lay out every single piece covered the entire dining room table, not a ton of room for much else. Well, this would be less of an issue while playing, because there's going to be a few pieces in the box, not everything's just spread out like that. It's still something to take into consideration because it's bigger than any other game I've ever played. Something I would have done differently in the process of making this is I would have tested more ideas at the beginning. I had all sorts of ideas like aliens and natural disasters, and I think I narrowed it down a little bit too quickly. it would have been better to just test the ideas and see if they worked rather than just assuming they wouldn't. I think this would have made a big difference to how good the gameplay is, because it would have been a lot of extra features to spice it up. I know I haven't talked too much about how the rules were developed in this presentation, but the biggest issue I have with them is the resource collection system. For being what you're doing about 90% of the time, I always thought it could be a bit better, but was just never able to find a fix for it. So I kind of just stuck with something that was all right, but a little bit boring. Some ideas of ways I could have made it better is needing like an upgrade to collect a resource. Well, I started implementing this idea with needing to upgrade your speeder to collect uranium. I think I could have elaborated on it more, like having oil rigs to have late game resource collection. What I learned that making a board game is a lot harder than I thought. I would always wonder before this why a game wouldn't make a blatantly obvious change that would make the game so much better. But what I figured out, it's actually quite hard to fix a lot of the problems, and it's also sometimes hard to see them. And you might think you know how a game's going to play. A lot of the time that's wrong, because testers always do something weird and goofy, changing how long the game takes to play and how it's actually played to begin with. This is because testers are very hard to predict and will make weird decisions. This has made me see how important testing is to design, and game design in particular. Thank yous. This project wouldn't have happened with a lot of people that I need to thank here. First of all, I'd like to thank my internal advisor, Jonkier Adrian Wilhelm Everhard van Liftioda. Thank you to my external advisors, Darren Edmondson and Joe Slack, for answering all my questions and helping in the process. I'd like to thank my mom for helping a lot with the production work, and just my mom and dad for just helping with basically everything in this project. I'd like to thank Atom and Lucas for helping with testing a lot. I'd also like to thank my cat for getting in the way and stealing the pieces and sitting on the project. Lastly, I'd like to thank you all for watching this presentation. Yes.
Awesome. I'm going to turn it over to the advisors for the first questions, but I'm sure there's lots of questions out in your audience. So go ahead, David.
Mr. Peterson, it was really, really incredible for me to see your development of this idea over the year. I know you started in grade 6, so 4 years ago. And it is amazing to me that here we are now, your presentation, you're saying, oh, I could fix this and I could fix that, and you're still considering ways to improve it. I think that speaks, A, to the complexity of what you did, and B, to your creativity and ingenuity thinking about the problems you need to solve. Unfortunately, Darren couldn't be here today, but I have his question. And he says, failure is an integral part of the design cycle. Can you provide an example of a change to the game that you thought would work, but through user testing discovered that it didn't? And how you incorporated this feedback?
Okay, so an example of this would be, I used to have a really weird system with like weight and power and all this stuff, where I'd have the engines powering everything, and then the rocket boosters would get like collect that power. It was super complicated. No one could understand it. I tested it quite a few times. So in the end, what I decided to do is I changed it to just have the two variables be a bit easier to understand. I changed power to be propulsion, and that's just given off by the rockets. So then you just need more propulsion than your weight. Just a lot easier to understand than all that weird stuff with needing power for the engine and yeah.
Great, thank you. And my question is, I mean, I think all your versions did this in a way, but the end result is really, really tactile. Like your pieces slip into slots, and you have metal resources and wooden and even stone resources, and you feel your resources. Everything you made is really tactile, which I just think is cool. It's kind of pricey though. So why did you decide to do this? Like, what's the benefit to you of having all the feel of the actual materials in your game?
Well, first of all, I think it's really satisfying to have all the really heavy pieces. Also, the weight on some of those metal resources kind of gives a sense of quality to the game, I find. I also find having physical pieces also makes it feel like you're actually doing what it is that it's symbolizing. So it's not just like you're marking something down, you're just like putting the piece on your ship, which is a lot better.
Can I illustrate that? Because I'm just realizing. So this is the little speeder, right?
Yeah.
And each of the things that you're collecting, tell me if I'm totally wrong, each of the things that you're collecting actually goes into a slot. So you can fit them in there, and then they don't move from your little speeder boat. That's cool. As Adrian said.
That's all. Well,
Okay, then we will open it up to the floor. I would just like to say how professional this looks. And I know you used Adobe Illustrator. This really could be marketed, and I'm sure someone will talk about that, but I'm incredibly impressed. Here, go ahead. Hold our microphones at the front, so if you could walk up to the front.
Excellent job, Mr. Peterson. I love board games, and so I would love to play this at some point between now and you finishing in a week. My question is, was there any game that you played that sort of inspired this style of board game?
That would be Catan. That was the main inspiration when I first made this, just having the randomized board and then you're collecting resources. That was a big inspiration.
Awesome.
But then I was just like, how can I make it different? So then I made it walking around the board instead of just building stuff.
Excellent. Are there any other board games that you really like to play and that you would recommend?
Probably Terraforming Mars. I just started playing it recently. It's pretty good. Still figuring out how the rules work, but yeah, pretty good.
Thank you.
not the crude VC.
Work, Mr. Peterson. My question to you is, how long does the actual board game take to make?
This version here took me about 15 hours, I would say, to sketch it all up on Illustrator and then print it and cut it. It also took my mom an additional 15 hours on top of that. So, yeah, in the end, it would be probably about 30 hours total work.
Mr. Musselman Anderson.
Smashing presentation, Mr. Peterson. You highlighted that there are a few issues in your game. Would you consider one day creating a new version to fix those?
Probably not, just because I don't really want to remake the board. Like, I might make slightly different versions of the rules, but that'd be because that's a lot easier to do, just write the rules differently.
Julian, come on up.
Excellent presentation, Mr. Peterson. What would you say was the biggest struggle in your board game?
The biggest struggle would be testing. found it really hard to find people to test. I don't know, I'm really bad at getting people to test. So like once I actually got it all set up, it'd be great, but it's just setting that up.
Misha,
To start, my question for you is, do you think you're gonna end up like actually marketing this and having it so people can buy it and play it?
I haven't fully decided if I'm gonna send it to a producer or not, but I have been thinking about it.
can you tell us about that process? Like when you have a prototype, how do you get that to market?
Not exactly sure. Pretty sure you like send it to someone and then they like will fix it up and make some changes and then they might market it. But I'm not entirely sure how it works. Haven't looked into that yet.
Ruby,
How would you win the game, and how long would the game normally take to play?
So you win the game, you kind of just like decide to eventually attempt to leave. There's a chance of failure depending on your decisions. And how long does it take to play? It took 2 hours one time I played it, but that's when it was a lot more complicated. So I'm guessing more like an hour now.
Do we ever get to play this game?
I don't know, sure.
Rowan, go ahead.
Great presentation, Mr. Peterson. Do you think there might be a time when you create a version of this game where the players work together as a team to get one communal ship off the planet?
I was actually thinking about doing that in testing. I just didn't do it because there wasn't as much flexibility in the amount of people that could play, because you'd need an even number if you wanted 2 people per ship.
Brad?
Mr. Peterson, thank you. I have been fortunate enough to work with you in this past. Barely, we just had a chance to meet, but so I wanted to offer a couple of comments and then I have a question. The first one is, at the school we talk about the values of the school being wisdom, courage, integrity, and relationships. And what I've seen today in this brief time is, I think you gained some wisdom. You've learned that some things, and maybe all things, are hard, and that we have to stand up together. That's wisdom, and we learn that things are hard. You have the courage to see that there are problems and go find solutions for them. That's not always an easy thing to do. It's easy to back away from a problem. Integrity, I'm impressed this started in grade 6. You've got this policy, this needs to be done, right? I made a commitment to myself, maybe to other people. And lastly, and maybe most impressively, was your work through this, you were always reflecting on what is the user experience. What's the relationship I'm trying to do and understand that games are social. So I'm saying wisdom, courage, and integrity and relationships displayed today, which makes you a real Ipsy guy. So, well done. Like Carrie, I think it was, who said you're a bit of a closet gamer, and it'd be great if we could, before you leave for the day, go through rites of passage and get a chance to sit down at the table and play a game. So we can do that.
Yeah, maybe we could set up a big game.
That'd be fun. Thanks.
A question, go ahead.
I really enjoyed it, and I think you did a tremendous job. And I think you have to own it by putting a copyright on it.
Yeah, true.
What?
Did you think of doing that?
I didn't really think about that all that much. I don't know. I was mainly thinking about just making the version and then figuring out what to do after.
Mr. Peterson, I enjoyed that so much and love the whole use of the design cycle and how you taught us about it at the beginning and talked about making the corrections and the adaptations, that design cycle of learning and going back and all that you did. It does take a lot of integrity to keep that up, so I was very impressed with that. You talked about testing and not really enjoying that part of it, but it's such a big part of the design cycle. What was the feedback, and then how did that affect you in terms of how you felt about the game?
Well, I'd find a bunch of issues, I guess, and I'd have to like find all these ways to fix it, which would take some time and make a new version. So, what kind of like how the feedback?
Well, so how many people did end up playing it, and what was the reaction from people?
Oh, I think most people thought it was pretty cool. Not a ton of people played it, but yeah, I think they thought it was pretty cool.
Sounds like more people want to try it.
Yes.
I have a question for you. I think you played Settlers of Catan with your grandparents
Yep.
and your parents. Do you guys have any comments on his ability in board games?
Well, he brought some of the earlier pieces to us on the paper pieces, and we could really see the development from being difficult and sometimes confusing to making sense and being challenging. So we quite enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'm glad that you had some testers in the family.
Yes.
Mr. Peterson Sr.?
We've enjoyed playing science fiction games like together weekly for years, and what a pleasure it is to see all of that manifested through your design process this year. Well done.
Yeah, that's great. Kate Harper for the final question.
Fantastic presentation, Mr. Peterson. I was wondering, do you have any like other game ideas that you are gonna like do later?
I haven't really had any other game ideas, so no, not really planning on doing anything.
Finn, I know you have a burning question.
Come on.
Are you planning to add anything to the game in the future? And will that be if you do?
Well, I'm thinking about like tweaking the rules, but I'm not really planning on adding all that much.
How many pages is your rule book?
Oh, the rule book? We don't talk about the rule book. It doesn't really exist.